it's in the gospel, he must increase while I must decrease. He kind of passes the baton.
Yeah, and that's made so explicit in the Gospel of John that scholars, historically skeptical scholars are like, right, okay.
How convenient. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan.
And I'm Dan Beecher.
And you are listening to the Data Over Dogma podcast, where we increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion and combat the spread of misinformation about the same. How go things, Dan?
Man, I'm ready to go. I'm excited because we've got a guest today, and I think some minds are going to get blue. We're going to blow some minds.
Yeah.
So,
and not in the Arrested Development sense,
right?
But in something hopefully a little more productive, a little more constructive. Our guest today is a longtime friend of mine, James F. McGrath. Welcome to the show, James.
Thanks so much. So good to be here on D&D D over D.
That's right.
And James is professor of New Testament at Butler University in lovely Indiana. I don't know that I've ever... What city in Indiana is it?
Indianapolis.
It is in Indianapolis. Okay.
Right there in India.
The namesake
All right.
itself. All right. Well,
James, I want you to know that I was talking to Dan about you, and at one point he said a sentence that I heard as, "He's a butler," and I was like, You've got a side job as a butler? No. Okay, fine. He's at Butler. I get it. All right.
Yeah. Well, when I was on sabbatical working on the book that we're going to be talking about today, I was in the UK for part of it, and hadn't heard of Butler University, and I was thinking they were going to think Butler Training School or something like that.
I like it. It's good to have a career you can fall back on.
There you go.
The Indianapolis School of Butlery. Or Butleridge, or whatever it's called. And when I was, I hung out with you for a day in Oxford last October at lovely Magdalen College, overlooking to some degree the garden there, which I was I was there back in October with my family. We decided to go hit up the garden since I had such a lovely time last time. So thank you for introducing that to me.
Oh, thanks for stopping by and hanging out. It was, that's always fun. But yeah, this was, I basically took a year and did very little else other than think about John the Baptist. Write down the results of that.
So I think that's a great intro into what we are going to be talking about. The title of your book, which I think is a great title, is Christmaker, which is fantastic. And what we're talking about John the Baptist, who I thought I might know something about, but it turns out I knew almost nothing. I mean, and you've mentioned this sort of in the intro to the book. You talk about how when people just sort of assume that they know what, if they've read the New Testament, they feel like they got a sense of John the Baptist. If you go to galleries around the world, you see paintings of a guy with crazy hair and some sort of caveman loincloth made out of camel, and then you're like, and he got a guy wet, and that's kind of what you know about John the Baptist. And I was surprised to learn that there is a lot more that to know about this figure, and I'm excited to get into it with you. And maybe we should start with just, who was this guy? We know that he was the same time frame as Jesus, but he wasn't a disciple of Jesus. It was kind of the other way around.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that oftentimes is the first. It's like, wait, Jesus was someone else's disciple? No, can't be. And a lot of people, respond, quite forcefully in a negative way to that idea even being floated. But on the one hand, we have, Jesus being baptized by John, which seems to indicate, at the very least, it indicates Jesus' acceptance of John, his teaching, his movement, right, in some way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm.
But then Jesus also, I mean, he praises John in a way he doesn't praise anyone else. He connects his own authority and activity with John in a way that, John keeps coming up. It's like, John, the Son of Man, there's, you want to know by what authority I do these things? Well, let me ask you one question. John's baptism. And so he constantly is linking himself with John. And so there's so much there that suddenly we're like, oh, that's why he was doing it. He was his disciple. He was part of his movement. He was possibly casting himself as his successor, or maybe even more than that.
And through a lot of this book, one of the ways that you're kind of extracting a lot more data out of the New Testament than many people might assume at first glance is available is that you're trying to put together explanations for why we're seeing the stories being told the way that we are seeing them being told. And one interesting thing about Jesus's baptism is it seems to present this as some kind of chance encounter. Like in Mark and in the other presentations, apart from the nativity story that has Jesus and John linked from before birth, Jesus just walking around and just like, hey, you're doing this, right? Let's go ahead and get this taken care of. What reason do you suppose the New Testament authors had for kind of sloughing off, getting rid of some of this background and telling the story in the sparse way that they tell the story?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of it is just the way ancient people tell stories, right? Unless they are doing a big epic, poetic telling of something where you're going into lots of detail. And then even then there's a lot of repetition, but you're still, as a modern person might feel it's still sparse on some of the details and description. But it seems to have been common knowledge in these circles that the start of the good news, the start of the story is with John. Time and again, that's, what we get, right? Mark goes there, as the beginning of the good news is John. In the Gospel of John, John's the first human being to appear, even before Jesus, right? If we've got the timing of, where they're appearing on the scene in that prologue, right? And then in Acts, when it talks about, the beginning of all of this, right? I mean, Luke had started with, I'm going to tell you the story about all these important things that happened, and then starts with John's parents. But then in Acts, you have, we're going to pick somebody to replace Judas. And so we'll go back to the very beginning, and that's not Jesus, it's John. Mm-hmm. And so I think everybody simply knew this to some extent. And so there's definitely some effort to emphasize Jesus' relative importance to John. Jesus kind of made that hard for the movement as it was developing, right? You couldn't shift focus away from John entirely because Jesus spoke so highly of John. Mm-hmm. I think some of John's followers may have found it easier to reject Jesus than vice versa.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah, because it seems like there was a big John movement before Jesus even came into the picture. Can you talk a little bit about what that might have been, what it probably looked like?
Yeah, and I think some of how we deduce that is, putting together what we know about, ancient movements in general, and what we know about the Jesus movement, upon which John was actually a major influence, and connect those things with the things that were explicitly told. And so, one, I think, mistaken notion that people have is that, John in the wilderness, he was something like a hermit, right? Living out in the middle of nowhere. And I mean, even if that had been the case, given how many people apparently went to, hear him wherever he was, he must have had apostles, right? He must have had people that he could send out, right? It wasn't like, if you're doing some cool stuff in the wilderness of YouTube, but, you're worried that nobody's going to just find you there, right? With all this, barren landscape that's surrounding you. And so, you got to get into, you got to send apostles out. You got to get something on TikTok to, where people really are, whatever it is that, gets people to come. And so we don't know for sure whether John, how much John actually went into, let's say, cities and towns and talked there. But at the very least, you'd either have to say, the only option for a historian is to say that he sent people out to invite people, right? Otherwise, you'd have to have, angelic messengers or booming voices from the sky or something telling people where to go. And so even in that, right, it's possible that before Jesus, joined the movement, John must have had people that went out and proclaimed his message and invited people to hear it and things of that sort.
No. It seems like, I mean, you talk a little bit in the book about the fact that John didn't invent religiously dunking people in water, but he may have invented this concept of baptism. Talk about what baptism is and why it's associated with John and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So baptism is something that's so familiar to Christians, I think, that it's like, I don't think I ever, before I started working on this book project, ever stopped to ask, so how on earth does somebody ever come up with the idea for this? Right?
Yeah.
You're going to dunk people in water, and that's going to be forgiveness. Yeah. And you look at what Christian baptism is supposed to symbolize, right? Dying and rising with Christ. Well, and so you're united with Christ. It's not an obvious symbolism, right? It seems like that's been added on as an additional layer. And we get the sense from our sources that, Christian baptism is sort of taking John's baptism and giving it a new spin and saying, if you want to connect with the Holy Spirit, you really need this, right? Mm-hmm. But in the process, we hear about people who were baptized only with John's baptism, right? And the fact that this had spread quite widely before anything that is starting to become Christianity appears on the scene. And so John becomes nicknamed the Baptist, and that could mean, or the dipper, the dunker, the immerser, whatever we might want to call him. And that can be one of two things. Either you have a group like the Baptists, right? We have that today. And so if you have somebody who is a part of that group and hang out among Catholics, and might call him John the Baptist or something like that, right? The other is that he is this person who really was the innovator, right, and the spearhead and the driving force of this new movement. And I'm inclined to think that the latter makes better sense, the evidence, because we get not just John the Baptist and reference to daily baptizers and the Baptist movement and things like that, but also reference to John's baptism, right? And so it seems to be this thing that people are aware that he's doing something different.
Yeah.
And he's doing this in an era when, on the one hand, immersing in water is a familiar practice, right? More so than perhaps ever before. But for that very reason, I think not only does that tell us that John must have been doing something different, right? And something that stood out in this context, enough for him to get the nickname, but also that it can't have been the very sort of scaled down immersion that you'd get in, let's say, some certain, like Protestant evangelical churches where it's like, you dunk, you might get asked a question and then, you get out of the water and it's over and, get to the potluck or whatever else is next, depending on which tradition it's in the context of. There must have been, some ritual, right? There must have been formulaic phrases. There must have been things that would persuade people that this is something meaningful and help them to have some sort of experience in the context of this ritual.
Right.
Now, when I've been asked about baptism in the past, what I think the conventional wisdom, at least as I have perceived it, and what I've shared with groups in, when we're in Israel and Palestine and we come across a mikvah, the idea, as far as I had always understood it, was that this was just kind of an incremental elaboration on a mikvah. The kind of thing you found at Qumran among the people who were responsible for transcribing the Dead Sea Scrolls. But in the book, you talk about this as something that's a pretty radical departure from the mikvah. Can you talk a little bit about the purposes of the mikvah and the relationship to what John seems to be doing with the baptism?
Yeah. So a mikvah, an immersion pool, purification, bath, however one wants to put it, for people who may not be familiar with them, I'll encourage them to Google it, right? MIKVEH, will get you to some pictures and you can see one if you've never, because a picture sometimes is worth 1,000 words. But the Jewish law, and even more so for some of the some of the particular groups that put a particular emphasis on purity, maintaining ritual purity, right, which is not the same thing as hygiene or cleanliness. Being pure in a ritual sense meant cleansing oneself of contact with or avoiding contact with things that were felt to be incompatible with sacred space, right? So particularly the temple and entrance into the temple. Mm-hmm. And some sought to integrate that more apparently into daily life. But at the very least, for those going into the temple, there were requirements, right? If you had contact with a corpse, right? If somebody had given birth, they could not go into the temple for a certain amount of time. And I like that example, particularly because it helps people understand that you're impure, ritually impure, and can't go into the sacred space after giving birth. But giving birth is a blessing, right? It's not that you did something wrong, right? And so impurity and sin are sometimes, one is used as a symbol of the other, but they're not the same thing.
That's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah. And so a mikveh was used because in this time period, people had taken the references to washing, right? They'll wash themselves and taken it as full immersion, right? And it's not something that's explicit in most texts that you must immerse, but that became the way of doing things. And anyone who enjoys a nice bath, in hot weather will appreciate that this probably was, you could see why this would catch on. But we're not told that John or Jesus or anyone else connected with his movement immersed in a mikveh or immersion pool to practice baptism, right? It seems to consistently be in rivers and sources of flowing water, which in Aramaic was living water. And so it seems as though John may have chosen other venues, as it were, right? Other modalities of immersion, both because it gave a different experience, but also it symbolically and even visually, locationally distinguished what he was doing from what others were doing.
So what was he doing? What like you sort of mentioned that Christianity has glommed onto this as a way of you mentioned sin forgiveness or wiping away of sin. Is that a John innovation, or where did that come from?
Yeah, so there are some great texts that might inspire one to do something like this, or at the very least one could latch onto and say, look, this justifies it, right? Doing that with biblical texts is not a new practice, right? I'm sure I know you address it quite often, some of the things that people do with texts, some of which are it's like, but it was interesting. One of our fellow bloggers just blogged about Isaiah chapter 1 today, and I was like, yeah, good. Draw attention to that text before my book comes out, because that seems like one of those places where you could get away with your sacrifices, right? And all the noise of your worship and all this stuff is displeasing to me. Practice justice, and then wash yourselves clean. And
you, make you clean.
Yeah, and so somebody who I think that you need somebody who's primed to look for an alternative to the sacrificial system, and I think I've deduced some things about why John might fit that fit that description. But
if you're willing to go into that, I wanted to talk about this a little bit.
Yeah.
From Luke, we get a little bit about John's family and John's birth, and you talk a little bit about how there seems to be, based on what John gets from his father and what John gets from his mother, attention in the path that he has laid before him for his life, which has a lot to do with this idea of we're not a part of the temple superstructure and everything that goes on there, which might be responsible for John's kind of use of alternative means of seeking forgiveness for sins. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as that tension that John is born into?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was hoping that would come up, not least because there's this time lag between this general audience biography, which I think is well-informed academically, but is written hopefully accessibly for anyone to read it. But then there's going to be in October, a big, thick academic monograph that's going to dig into some of the details that scholars care about. And because there's that lag, I'm very curious what a fellow academic will make of some of my deductive reasoning and inferences and things.
I was going to say
some of that more detailed argument.
Yeah, briefly, I was going to say I was reading part of this and I was like, there seemed to be some methodological assumptions going on here, but it wasn't until later that I saw that you were going to include your defense of those assumptions in the bigger book. So I look forward to that bigger book. But I'm sorry, I interrupted. Continue.
No. I've given academics just enough to say, What is he doing? But hopefully to make it interesting enough that they'll come back and circle around and read the bigger book. Yeah. But so the starting point for some of the deduction that I sort of the deductive process that I went through in working on this book was realizing that not only do we not see John following in his father's footsteps and practicing as a priest, that wouldn't necessarily tell us a lot because priests didn't get to serve in the temple all that regularly. It was a bit hit or miss. You're called on duty, but then may or may not be chosen, things like that. So that didn't necessarily tell us much. But if he's proclaiming an alternative mode for obtaining forgiveness and connecting with God and doing these things, expressing one's repentance, then that's not just going into a different line of work than your father. That's setting up a competing business, basically. Right? And one that undercuts the pricing strategy of your father's business, which, because immersing in water takes, your time and effort, but doesn't cost you what sacrifice would cost you and travel to the temple.
It's a low overhead gig. Yeah.
And so my immediate reaction once I realized, I was like, there's got to be a really interesting family backstory to this, right? And I wish I knew what it was. And do I speculate? No, I better not. It's going to be too. But as I was pulling on all these threads and looking closely at some of the details about John, started paying attention to the fact that he's depicted as being a Nazarite, right? Someone who's committed, as very few other people that we know of were, to be bound by this vow, right? That people often took for a short period of time, but to be bound by this vow for life, right? And so we have Samuel and Samson, right, in the Jewish scriptures, who are, they will never cut their hair and will never partake of wine or strong drink, grape products, and are dedicated to God in this way. Mm-hmm. And we get allusion to that in Luke's infancy story. And first reaction as a scholar working with historical critical methods is, but we can't base anything on that, can we? But of course, even when you have these very symbolic, highly, fictionalized and scripturalized narratives that you get in infancy stories, in ancient biography and other literature, you still have incorporated those things that people knew about the individual, right? Names of parents, for instance, can find their way in there, and you don't invent new names if you happen to know the names of somebody's parent, right?
Right.
And so John would have been visible. He may not have looked as much like Hagrid as people tend to assume, but he would have. The hair might be about right.
Still very tall, though, probably 7-8 feet tall.
Well, I like to think so because he's earned my respect as a part of this thing, and I tend to look up to people who have exceeded me in stature and not as a smaller individual. But he's depicted as being committed to this, and then I came across the fact that priests are required to keep their hair tidy and trim, right? It's there in the scriptures. And the wording that's used in Hebrew is actually, it's basically the exact opposite of what's required of the Nazarite, right? So the Nazarite keeps their hair this way, and the priest is prohibited from keeping their hair that way, right? And so suddenly you have this tension, right? John is the son of a priest, but you have this Nazarite vow. And so that got me thinking that, one possible explanation for this, I'm pretty sure this never came up for anyone, right? Because how often do you have somebody who's a priest and then there's, lifelong commitment to, but you could very easily imagine, as people do today, John's mother, if she was, had not managed to have a child, reading these stories about the patriarchs and saying, God, if you'll do for me what you did for Hannah, then I'll do with my child what you did, what Hannah did with her child. And
very similar for Manoach and his wife in Judges 13. Yeah. They are older and childless, and then the angel visits them and blesses them.
Yeah. And so whether you want to, say it was Elizabeth's sort of motivated action, if people who are inclined to work angels into the story as well can always, do that. But there's no need sort of for a historian to do that. But if you have someone who is dedicated in this way, then they're going to find themselves torn between their father's vocation, right? And which is their own, not just heritage, but imperative, right? If you are the son of a priest, you become a priest.
Well, it's an incredible privilege too.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, and presumably so is being a Nazarite, right? It's like Samuel or Samson, Right. But John would have found himself not just torn between mother and father, but I think it might have also led him to some insights about Scripture, because you have a commandment that seems perfectly straightforward: honor your father and mother. What do you do when father and mother are pulling you in different directions? And you might assume, okay, patriarchal context, we'll go with that, but it's not spelled out in that way.
And you think in this time period, the Hasmonean kingdom is getting a lot of flack, particularly as we get into the 1st century CE, and we see this at Qumran. We see this in places where the authority of the high priesthood that is now being assigned by Rome is in doubt. It's being rejected. Do you think that plays a role, perhaps, in John's decision?
Yes, and certainly, John has. There's a long history of associating John with the Essenes. It goes back. It's interesting. One of the things that I noticed working on this project is that it goes back before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The
Essenes are mentioned by Josephus.
Yeah, and there was enough hint of some bathing and stuff that it was like, people have been proposing that, and so I think that that primed some people to then make those connections. John doesn't, which
is why you said it in the book. I was thinking of it when you introduced it. I was like giggling to myself about the video they show you at the visitor center at Qumran, where they're kind of hinting at that guy John who. Went off and did his own thing, might have been a member of the Qumran community.
And so there were, it was not just the Essenes that were critical of the temple and of the priesthood. And the Essenes, one thing that I think was different between John and the Essenes is that the Essenes were eager to get back there, right? They just needed the right priests to be in place doing things the right way. And, it's terrible when you see something being managed a certain way, and the best way for that to be done, and nobody will just put you in charge of it. But John seems to have had a different sort of angle, and seems to have been offering something that bypassed the temple in a way that we don't get in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so there definitely was conversation possible, and to that extent, John's alternative to temple sacrifice probably resonated with a wider cultural current.
I think one of the things that I'm going to jump a little bit, because one of the things that I found that was a revelation for me. I'm not a well-studied person in this, so I was not aware, and I think a lot of our listeners might be shocked to learn that not only did John have his own sort of separate ministry or I don't know what to call it, but his own followers and his own movement back in Jesus's time, they still exist. Like there is a religious movement that still follows John the Baptist and does not follow Jesus.
And I think you, James, you're one of very few scholars, I think, who specializes in the study of this group, which is also the only remaining Gnostic community that survives from antiquity. So a lot of people don't know much about the Mandaeans. Can you talk a little bit about that and their relationship to John the Baptist?
Always happy to talk about the Mandaeans.
That's what I thought.
if somebody were traveling the world and going to the most remote places they could, and happened across a Gnostic group that were, immersing in, they're speaking or using for the scriptures a dialect of Aramaic, and they mention all these biblical figures, and they consider themselves followers of John, but don't like Jesus and think Jesus was a follower of John's who went off the rails. I mean, this would be making headlines, right? I mean, you think about, the Nag Hammadi discoveries, right? And so it's just bizarre to me that the Mandaeans are not better known. And of course, there was fascination with them. And I think the reason why we don't see the same level of familiarity today is precisely because they had their heyday a while back in terms of awareness in the English-speaking world, to think of that in particular. And it was the translation of one of their, their most sacred text into Latin that sort of sparked off the Theosophical movement and some of the modern esotericism, which is fascinating.
Oh, really?
Well, yeah.
So at the end of the 19th century, somewhere around there? Or when was this?
Going back earlier than that. So it was 18th, I want to say 18th century. We have, is it Norberg's translation of the, what do you call it? Liber Adami, I think was the way the title he gave it, Book of Adam. And so, the sort of 19th century theosophical movements, were drawing on that and make reference to it.
Okay.
And so then you had early 20th century, the scholars like Richard Reitzenstein in Germany doing sort of the history of religion stuff, and then Bultmann drawing on that and bringing it into New Testament, but plugging things in very uncritically. I'm going to have a more extensive treatment of this in the big book coming in October. But Bultmann would find be looking at one verse and see two redactional hands at work and do this whole thing, and then would quote this passage from a Mandaean text and plug it in as background. And first of all, the Mandaean texts are later, right? And so they need to be used much more cautiously. But also, there's none of that close redactional analysis to say, so is all of this of one piece or anything? And I'm not saying that it's, he should, I think he had an oversensitive redactional radar, as it were. But, seeing all this editorial work and things like that in these texts and then plugging in something else from later as background without asking the same kinds of questions is problematic. And so then there's this backlash against it, and they've been ignored. And so, so let me, having said some of that stuff that, that's the stuff Dan will find interesting. Now the stuff Dan will find interesting. This is a group that is Gnostic, which means that they think that the creator God in Genesis is not a very nice entity, right? This is, not the ultimate source of all things, not even the ultimate source of all things good and evil. This is a lower entity that sort of takes this material world that comes about as a result of cosmic mishap, essentially, and rules over it and orders it in a way that is not great because it doesn't have great stuff to work with, right?
Yeah.
And
this is based on a middle Platonic notion that the spiritual is divine, whereas the fleshly, the corporeal, is corrupt and wicked. And
it certainly at least connects with that. And they found the Gnostics that were in sort of the Greek-speaking world and in areas where you could interact with Greek philosophy, definitely were latching onto that and were making common cause and influencing, as well as being influenced by that. But we also get it, in Mesopotamia, right? And you get it, interacting there. I think much less with Greek philosophy and much more with Zoroastrianism.
Okay.
And so you do get some hints of a sort of there being dark waters, right, as well as the waters of the light world. And then you get the reflection going on, and then it kind of gets corrupted in that way. And so the possibility that there's some sort of more permanent dualism of some sort, is at least explored. And for anyone who's dived into the Gnostic texts that we've had published, Lane Pagel's Gnostic Gospels or things like that, will know that they were not very concerned about consistency in their in their cosmology and things like that. So they explore ideas, and it's fascinating. But so they practice immersion in living water. They don't consider John their founder because, like Gnostics did, ancient and modern, they think that their religion goes back to Adam, and you have light world beings from the very start of humanity's creation, coming and trying to reach us and share with us the good news that if you realize that there is a world beyond this material world, you can actually prepare to escape from it when you die and ascend beyond it to the place where goodness sort of thrives, as it were.
Where everybody knows your name.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, you mentioned that the Mandaean texts are later. Do we have a good idea of the time period? Is this 2nd century? Are we into the 3rd and 4th century?
Yeah, so I don't think anything could safely be traced back before the 3rd century.
Okay.
We do have, the one thing that has often caused some misunderstanding is that some of them, at the very least, have been interpolated and redacted in like the Islamic era and things like that. But what's interesting is that oftentimes we can see, scholars like us will immediately recognize that, where it's like talking about Judaism and the Torah and things like that, and they'll say, and the Arabs got circumcision from and then veers off into this thing, and it's and veers off onto a subject that is not a focus anywhere else in this text or things like that.
Well, I can imagine without a gigantic institution and the pressures of such an institution, there's more liberty with the way these texts are transmitted.
Yeah. So in a sense, the ritual is the canon, right? The ritual is the thing that they try to safeguard, and it's like it's inerrant and it can't be changed.
Okay.
The texts, were not treated in the same way, except in as much as the texts helped pass along the prayers and elements of the ritual.
What are some of the earliest manuscripts of Mandaean texts?
So I mean, some of our complete manuscripts tend to be just a couple of 100 years old, are not all that old. There's a big collection in the Bodleian Library. That's why I was in Oxford when you saw me there. On the other hand, we have some of the same formulas and prayers and things incorporated into things like incantation bowls that are found in the Mandaean's historic context in Mesopotamia, where same light world beings, same kinds of formulas are being mentioned in there, and like in the 4th or 5th century. We have, I want to say I'm trying to remember what century Theodore Barconi is, but he quotes from Mandaean sources. And we have even things like, Manichaean sources that seem to be quoting from and drawing on Mandaean sources.
Interesting.
Some very early ones. And so triangulating back and figuring out when this religion takes something like the form in which we now find it is challenging.
Yeah.
I certainly don't want to say, lest anyone get the wrong impression, that John was a Gnostic.
Right.
Any more than I want to say that we have the Nag Hammadi text, and so Jesus was a Gnostic in the sense that those later texts develop. But I think that John provides an important clue to the emergence of this thing that becomes a really powerful worldwide religious trend and movement in its own right. When you consider Gnosticism, its rebirth in modern esotericism, the fact that there are Christians around the world who nonetheless, really like the Gospel of Thomas and the, various other texts. This is a movement that's continuing to make an impact, and not just on the Mandaeans, who are a fairly small number.
Yeah. Being Gnostic is kind of like being Antifa. Like, you don't get a membership card. It's a very kind of loose collection of. There's a large spectrum of relationship to the ideologies of that.
I thought you were going to say it's just it's a label that's only put on you by the people who disagree with you.
Well, right. and that's another way to think of it. But I just one more question before we get to Dan's question. It strikes me that you have. In the Mandaeans, the convergence of at least 3 different traditions. You have something to do with John the Baptist, you have something to do with Gnosticism, and you have something to do with Zoroastrianism. And it sounds like they kind of took root in Mesopotamia. Is there, and again, a lot of this is speculative. We can't really unpack everything going back in time, but is there a sense for any kind of order that this happened, or they're like John the Baptist followers moved to Mesopotamia to escape from the Jesus movement and met up with Zoroastrians there, or is it Gnostics who were like, this Jesus guy's a little weird, let's pick up this John the Baptist guy? Is there a sense for that, or is it just kind of all these things are all a part of this tradition and it's fungible basically at this point? Yeah,
it's challenging to answer those questions, but you'll find, particularly among New Testament scholars who've never actually looked at these texts, there are some assumptions about answers to that. You'll hear things like that. They might have borrowed John in order to fly under the radar of Islamic authorities or something like that, and that doesn't fit at all. Not least because they say fairly negative things about Islam and Muhammad and about Jesus, who's also a prophet in Islam, and so. Unless you want to say they did that, they did this clever thing to fly under the radar of Islamic authorities, but didn't realize that insulting other prophets would undermine them, and so botched it completely. So the Mandaean texts mention Jerusalem more than they have this inordinate attention to Jerusalem and its surroundings, which even I did a comparison, the Babylonian Talmud is much longer as a corpus than the Mandaean texts. But in terms of, sort of like per page, kind of how often do we get references, and this is a tradition that considered itself to be essentially an expatriate community, right, with its roots in Judah and Judaism and Jerusalem. And it's more frequent, right? And they blame the destruction of Jerusalem on, the persecution of essentially Mandaeans, right? Disciples. And so I think that it's hard to account for that if this is a group that comes about in Mesopotamia, right? I think that they need to have some sort of historic connection, and then there needs to be some movement. And I think the best way to make sense of all the different pieces of, and signs of influence is to suggest that this was a Jewish esoteric movement or an Israelite esoteric movement, because I think it had some broader traditions beyond what was defined as or understood as Judaism in that time.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes its way to Mesopotamia and continues to exist within the framework of the local community as an esoteric, secretive tradition that has its own views and beliefs and some mystical practices. And so we get some things that are at the very least dialogue, but might even be influence of some of these, some of the Gnostic forms of mysticism on, more mainstream Jewish mysticism. Right?
Mm-hmm.
You look at some of the diagramming of light world beings and the emanations and things, and it looks like the Sephirot, from
Yep.
Merkabah mysticism and Kabbalah. And so you get these intersections. And so I think they were an esoteric tradition still within that context until at some point, their beliefs come to light, or somehow, people become aware of them. Someone with authority in the synagogue starts, doesn't like what's going on, gets wind of it or something, and you get some sort of separation. And so that was one of the first things that I, as a foray into this area was bringing my work on the Gospel of John, where you have this sense that you have a community that has this, it's been described as being rather anti-Jewish, and yet it's also Jewish, right? And and so that this process of being sort of driven out from a community that one was a part of might have played a similar role, and there may have been a similar dynamic in the case of the Mandaeans, probably within a Mesopotamian context. Although, as with Christianity, not all necessarily in the same manner and in the same way everywhere in the world.
Yeah,
I was curious. You mentioned the Mandaean literature, and I'm curious how sort of scholars, because it seems like that's sort of probably there's a lot of information there about John the Baptist. How much do you think you can trust that as being informative about this figure, and how much do you think it's just sort of legend that they've created about this man?
Yeah, and I think one could assume even before going into it, based on experience with other sacred texts and traditions, that there's going to be some legend, and there's also the possibility that there may be some useful historical information. And the question is there enough of the latter to justify it having your attention if you're interested in historical stuff? But then how to get at it, right?
Yeah.
And so, in the bigger book that's coming later, that's one of those methodological things that Dan, when he was reading, was probably wished was already available. I discuss, I think that Mandaean texts, plugging them in as background uncritically, trusting them or ignoring them are, the two extremes, both of which are problematic, and that we should use them the way we use, rabbinic tradition if we're interested in the first century. Later rabbinic sources, despite some of the scholarship of past centuries, is not the religion of Jesus' time, right? But it's influenced by the religion of Jesus' time, and sometimes there are things embedded in there that help us to understand things that were going on in the first century, right? Because they are outgrowths from that along a different avenue, right? In the same way, we're spoiled if we work on the historical Jesus. We've got these early sources. That's often not the case. If we didn't have the Gospels, and I actually have this thought experiment in the bigger book, and all we had was the Nag Hammadi stuff, we'd actually be able to get back to, we might struggle to get back to, but we'd have maybe even more than we'd realize from the historical Jesus, right? Because there's this stuff in the Gospel of Thomas that, because we have the synoptic gospels, we know some of these are versions of sayings that probably were historical. Mm-hmm. And so one thing that hasn't been done yet, and I'm eager to see some other people work on this, besides me and a very, very small number of other people who have an interest in it, is there's teaching attributed to John in Mandaean sources. We can't trust it that this is like a verbatim record or even a close approximation, but there may be things embedded in it, right? Certainly some of the same ideas, emphases on social and economic justice and things like that come across. And so there's reason to at least ask the question, because we don't have great first century, we don't have the equivalent of multiple first century gospels about John the Baptist. And so in that circumstance, I think we should take these things and critically weigh what they tell us. And as one of the first people to be doing that, I'm sure I'm going to get a lot wrong. And I'm pretty sure I'm not done with John the Baptist. I finished working on this and was like, what do I do next? I'm like, yeah, I should just do more John the Baptist. It's like, I don't think it's done here. But we need more eyes and ears, paying attention to this and asking these questions and looking from a different angle. But I think there's much more there that will prove to be valuable for our understanding of Christian origins, for our understanding of John the Baptist, for our understanding of ancient religion than is really appreciated.
Yeah. I'd like for you to talk a little bit. You mentioned you sort of mentioned in passing that the Mandaeans aren't fans of Jesus and sort of don't love where Jesus took John's teachings. I would love to talk a little bit about both their perspective and maybe just the perspective of, if we could imagine a follower of John, what Jesus might have looked like to them, because I don't think that that's a perspective that anyone has really considered. Scholars like you have considered it. Obviously, I had never thought about it. Obviously, like when you're raised with a Christian tradition, of course, John would be excited for Jesus to become, this Messiah figure. But that may not have been what John was after. That may not have been John's perspective, or the people that are following John. So I'd love to have you talk about that.
Yeah. Thank you. So I knew it was going to be potentially focusing the attention in a particular way that might or might not be helpful and might or might not be appreciated in some circles. Calling the book Christmaker. Yeah. I thought, but once I got that, I was like, okay, but it's a good title. It's good. And, particularly, I'm hoping, Mandaeans are going to, actually read this and appreciate that I'm working their sources into this attempt to get at the historical John the Baptist. They're obviously going to take as much exception to some of the things that I say as, Christian scholars take to some of the things I say about, historical Jesus or about John. But I think that historically speaking, we have John depicted as talking about one who will come after him, presumably meaning, a disciple who will be stronger than him. Yet we also have people talking about the possibility that he's the Messiah. Right? And Luke is pretty upfront about that. And so if he's clearly saying, no, not me, I'm not the Messiah, right? He's doing this Monty Python routine right back in the first century. And everybody's like, see, or the Dune thing, right? Only the true Messiah would say he's not the Messiah. I think that actually John must have been speaking in a way that was a bit more elusive and less easily pinned down. I think his life was, seems to have been cut short so that he didn't get a chance to say to everyone, okay, so my time is coming to an end here. And so you should all follow Jesus, right? He was, we worked closely together, before I was imprisoned, and, he's the way I think the movement should go. Right. Mm-hmm. And so clearly Jesus followers believe that, and it's not necessarily historically implausible.
Well, it's in the gospel. He must increase while I must decrease. He kind of passes the baton.
Yeah. And that's made, so explicit in the Gospel of John that scholars, historically skeptical scholars are like, right. Okay.
How convenient.
It's like, he was not the light. He just gave witness, bore witness to the light. It's like, okay, you seem to think this is important. Who's saying the opposite, right? And you look around, it's like, there's this wider movement. And I think that as time went on, right, certainly once Jesus is executed and, it's like, no, he'll be back and he's going to do this, and still time is passing. I think other figures emerge who say, no, it was not Jesus, and, maybe it will be me. And so we get this ongoing movement. and probably also get some who, as also happens with Gnostic forms of Christianity, just say, well, it's the spiritual message that matters, and kind of the apocalyptic stuff can be phased out or toned down.
Now, can you talk a little bit about one of the chapters is entitled "The Last Days." Can you talk about the decline and fall of John the Baptist? How the end of his life plays into basically how his tradition has been carried on.
Yeah, so it would be easy, and I'm sure I at least initially, went this route that, of thinking, well, at least we've got this vivid story of his execution, right? And so, if we don't, there's a lot that we don't know, but here's this nice big puzzle piece, with several interlocking bits that we can slot in. Mm-hmm. But often when we have a particularly vivid story told in an ancient source, it'd be very easy to just assume that it's historical because it's early and it's vivid and it's got lots of detail. But in actual fact, Mark is our only source for that. Matthew and Luke repeat some of what Mark says, but right. Mark is the source. Josephus indicates that Herod Antipas executed John, but doesn't give us, there's no no mention of a birthday party. Not that there's any reason why why Josephus would have mentioned that. And so eventually it struck me that, in the story of, the birthday and the dancing girl and Herodias and all this, that you get this attempt to shift the blame away from Herod Antipas, right, who's sort of the representative of secular, authority and rules at Rome's behest. And we get the same thing in the story of Jesus' execution, where there's this effort to divert the attention and say, well, no, I mean, the representative of secular authority didn't really want to kill him, but, the hands were tied. Right? Yeah. And so that parallel between those two ways of dealing with the story of the execution of these key figures in this movement, that parallel had not struck me in quite the same way, right? And you do get it mentioned, but it's usually Mark's telling of John's story prefigures the death of Jesus, or there's foreshadowing, there's intertextual echoing or whatever else, but not in terms of this effort to divert attention away. And so I don't think anyone is likely to have known whether, who, if anyone, danced at Herod's birthday party or anything like that. The tradition identifies the girl as Salome, but there's actually significant problem having that be the person, given when this is supposed to have happened and what we're told in Josephus about, sort of Herod and Herodias and their family and things like that. But I think that we can actually connect John's death as depicted in Josephus and in the Gospels, and find that they do actually dovetail in some interesting things that probably do point us to some useful historical information. So in the Gospels, John's main criticism of Herod Antipas is his divorce of his first wife and his marriage to Herodias, who had been his brother's wife. And the details, it's the sort of things that kings and tetrarchs and people who wish they were kings did in the ancient world. And so, but there seems to have been some illegality, at least with regard to the timing and other things. But Josephus says that when Herod Antipas was defeated by Aretas, that some blamed this, basically said that, he's getting his comeuppance for what he did to John. And that's often viewed, some have said that, Josephus must be getting the dating, or must be telling us that John lived much longer than Jesus did, because he tells his story about the sort of the end of the conflict, and it's like 37-ish. And so, John must have died then. But it would have been natural to connect these two, right? So the death of John, the execution of John several years earlier, and this event, when we consider that Herod Antipas's first wife was the daughter of Aretas. And so she flees back home, and that, Herod Antipas's terrible treatment of the daughter really sours the relationship, and that's what leads them into war. And I think that John the Baptist was calling out Herod Antipas, not just, you divorced and married for convenience, but you're dragging your people into a war that's foolish and that's bound to be disastrous. And in the process of his being defeated by Aretas, Herod Antipas's stronghold at Machaerus is one of the places that Aretas sort of conquers. Mm-hmm. And that's where John the Baptist, according to Josephus, had been executed. Right?
Oh.
And so we put, sort of all these things together. And I think we do get a sense that these things are complementary sources of information about this and not things that are actually in tension with one another.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So John the Baptist is not just, he's out there preaching forgiveness of sins and is socially concerned, but also to some degree geopolitically concerned. Or is this mainly about the well-being, the homeostasis of the Jewish people at the time? That he's thinking, hey, you're putting us in a vulnerable position by ticking off the wrong person's daughter.
Yeah, I don't think we necessarily have to choose between those.
Fair enough.
Yeah. More than one thing wrong with what a ruler's doing. But yeah, I think it's very interesting. One of the things that led me to really revisit some of and try to challenge some of the stereotypes is that, John is something of a judgment and fire and brimstone-y kind of preacher, but it's all aimed at the aristocracy, the religious leaders. But we're also told that he was listened to, and his message was appealing to tax collectors and prostitutes. And your standard fundamentalist preacher doesn't resonate with that audience. Your modern day fundamentalist preacher, the tax collectors and prostitutes are not going to be lining up to say, "Hey, this guy's speaking our language." Right.
Right.
And so I think that we have to get that rather like Jesus, right? There's harsh words and harsh criticism and sarcasm and, condemnation towards those in power. And there's compassion, right, for ordinary people. And this concern with social and economic justice, I think, connects with that, because on the one hand, you have, ordinary people who would have struggled to travel and to afford sacrifice and do these things. But then also even the tax collectors and the prostitutes who are complicit in some ways with the things that are going on in that time, or are victims who may further victimize, right, by, the way they then, bring others into this whole system that is to the advantage of very few, but not any of those people that we're currently talking about. Mm-hmm. And so John's teaching to them seems to have been, do what's within your power, right? God, will eventually sort out, there'll be the dawn of the kingdom of God, and the whole messed up system will be dealt with in some way, shape, or form. You don't need to take responsibility. The fact that you can't change the whole system doesn't mean that you just then join in with it. You as a soldier, you as a tax collector, just take what you're due, right? Yeah. Don't take more than that. Everyone is, living on the edge of starvation. You could potentially elevate yourself and your family out of that by, taking a bit more. And that's what everybody's doing. And everybody's trying to, as far as it depends on you, do this, do what's right.
Yeah.
And that, I think, resonated, right? Because I think he understood, I wonder if John's time in the wilderness, right, was not, a time in which he was thinking about these things and realizing, on the one hand, if he eats just what is sort of provided naturally, whether it's bee honey or date honey, and whether he actually dipped the locusts in the honey or, ate them separately, one of them was dessert or the other, we don't need to worry about that. But I think he probably, it would have dawned on him that you could actually disentangle yourself from injustice, but you're also not making things better, and you're not making a difference, and you're not doing anything that addresses what's wrong with the society.
Yeah.
And that being active and going back, involves getting your hands dirty. And so you have to, you have to have both a passion for justice and a means of forgiveness.
Yeah. And I think if he's influenced by texts like Isaiah 1, you have one of the strongest iterations of the prophetic critique within Isaiah 1. And so if there is a kind of a distancing from the institutions of the temple, I can see how the prophetic critique, the concern for social justice, as well as the concern for critiquing the systems that are facilitating all of this injustice, could be part and parcel to his message. So yeah, that's a great message to end the life of John the Baptist on. So not that he was a socialist, but at the very least was very concerned for systems of power and for ensuring that the people who are on the business end of them are not just afterthoughts, are not just grist for the mill. Anything else to add, Dan?
I think that there is more to talk about, and it's such a fascinating figure that we're going to grab you, James McGrath. We're going to keep you with us for our patrons only segment, so that people can hear a little bit more about this, because it is super interesting. But for those of you who aren't patrons, thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to reach out to us, if you'd like to become a patron, that's the first thing to do right now, which is to go to patreon.com/Data Over Dogma and just join up. If you want to hear the patrons only segment, join at the $10 a month level, and you can do that. Otherwise, you can hear an ad-free and early version of the show every week at the $5 a month level. Or you can just give however much you want to give us, and that's awesome as well. If you'd like to write into us, please feel free to do so. You can do it at contact@dataoverdogmapod.com. James McGrath, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate having you on the show.
Oh, thanks so much. I've just thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
I have as well. And we will see those of you who are joining us in the after party in just a moment. And for everyone else, bye, everybody.